And specifically, we're going to talk about the regulations that pertain to structural icing, as well as the certification of aircraft for flight into known icing conditions.
There are several regulations that deal with icing. We're going to take a look at Part 121, 135, 91, and then also we're going to look at aircraft certification under Parts 23 and 25.
So start out right away. I don't expect you to memorize these regulations. They won't be on the exam, but you should generally have an idea of what Part 121 and 135 say about icing. And specifically, you should know that Part 121 does have regulations that address icing. And here's one. It's 121, 341. Which says that to be able to fly in icing conditions, the airplane has to be equipped for means of removing ice from windshields, wings, empennages, and other things. And it goes on to say that, of course, no airplane can fly or no person may operate an airplane in icing conditions at night unless you have an ice light, which is a little light that shines on the wing, and you can see your accumulation then.
There are very specific regulations under Part 121 for icing, and there are also specific regulations in Part 135. In Part 135, 227, operating limitations say that unless the airplane has ice protection equipment as specified in the regulations, you can't fly under IFR in known or forecast light or moderate icing conditions. Part 121 and 135 are very specific as far as flight into known icing conditions. Part 91 is not as clear-cut, unless you're operating under Subpart F of Part 91, which deals with turbojet, multi-engine aircraft, and also large aircraft. But if you're flying a smaller airplane, piston-powered airplane, then you have to rely on 91.9, which deals with the civil aircraft flight manual, markings, and placard requirements. And it says that, except as provided in this paragraph, no person may operate a civil aircraft without complying with the operating limitations specified in the flight manual or the markings, placards, or otherwise prescribed. So in other words, you really don't have any clear-cut regulations, no specific regulations for icing for Part 91, a smaller aircraft. You're going to have to dig into the flight manuals, pilot operating handbook, or look around the airplane for placards and markings. Here is a pilot information manual for the Piper Seneca 3. The Piper Seneca 3 has an option for flight into known icing conditions. We're going to look into the manual and see where this is listed.
And here, if you look into the section 2 of the POH, or in this case, it's information manual. Specifically, it has types of operations, and it tells you what you can and can't do under Part 91. So it says this airplane can be flown day VFR, night VFR, day IFR, and night IFR. And then finally, if you take a look at E, it says if the aircraft is equipped in accordance with these regulations, you can fly it in icing conditions. So that is where you find out if the airplane is certified for flight into known icing conditions. You have to take a look at the POH, or the Pilot Operating Handbook, to find out if the airplane is FICI. FICI means flight is certified for flight into known icing condition, and that's an acronym that aviators use quite a bit, FICI.
There is some confusion about the term known icing. There have been a number of NTSB board decisions prior to 2006 that dealt with this, and specifically what they say is that it's the pilot's responsibility to determine if icing conditions do exist. Also, if there are no pilot reports of icing, that does not mean that no icing exists. The absence of icing pilot reports does not mean that there's no icing. And then also that it is the pilot's responsibility to do thorough pre-flight planning and find areas where icing is probable. Not a lot of pilots are familiar with these NTSB decisions or interpretations. So back in 2006, a flight instructor, Bob Miller, requested that the FAA define and interpret known icing. And he asked for the FAA's headquarters, General Counsel's office for an interpretation of known icing. The FAA Office of Chief Counsel, the Eastern Region Office, responded to Bob Miller's request with this interpretation. They said known icing exists when visible moisture or high relative humidity combines with temperatures near or below freezing. And since clouds are a form of visible moisture, flying through clouds at altitude that is near or below freezing would constitute flight into known icing conditions. Now, the problem with this is that they said that there is a high probability of icing when there are high relative humidities and temperatures colder than zero. And you can fly at temperatures much colder than zero with high relative humidity with no problems of icing. The interpretation of known icing from the FAA in 2006 caused quite a bit of controversy, and pilots were mad. As a matter of fact, AOPA asked the FAA to rescind the 2006 letter of interpretation, and they did. In 2009, the FAA came out with their response and their definition of known icing. And they say known or observed or detected ice accretion is synonymous with known icing. FAA also went further to say that pilots should have necessary weather knowledge to make sound flight decisions. So in other words, there was a lot of controversy during the period 2006 to 2009, but we're pretty much back to where we were before 2006. The definition of known icing is different than the definition of known icing conditions. From the Aeronautical Information Manual, known icing conditions are atmospheric conditions in which the formation of ice is observed or detected in flight. And it goes on further to say that because of the variability in space and time of atmospheric conditions, the existence of a report of observed icing does not assure the presence or intensity of icing conditions at a later time, nor can a report of no icing assure the absence of icing conditions at a later time.
But the point that I want to make here with all these slides that we just went through, the important thing is that you need to be aware of all available information, not just pilot reports telling you whether there's icing or not. You need to look at cloud bases, cloud tops. You need to look at air mets, SIGMETs, even go out to the icing forecast that's available, the CIP and the FIP, which we'll talk about later on. It's available at the Aviation Weather Center. So if that doesn't get you, then 91-103 will, pre-flight action. Of course, for pilots of small aircraft, you should be, before beginning the flight, you should become familiar with all available information for the flight. And that includes, if you're going IFR or not in the vicinity of the airport, weather reports and forecasts. So, in other words, the FAA is telling you that you need to do your homework before you go fly. So what we're going to do now is kind of quickly go through a very brief introduction to Part 25, ice protection. A number of years ago, gosh, it's almost more than 10 years ago now, I did a little work in icing certification with a couple of companies who contracted through UND. They used our research aircraft to look for icing conditions in clouds, and they wanted to have their aircraft certified. So Part 25 is where they talk about the certification. Also, there are advisory circulars available that tell you how to certify your flight into known icing conditions, that spell it out very specifically. I'm not going to go through all the details, but you can download these advisory circulars if you go to the FAA website, and you can find how to certify an airplane for flight into known icing conditions, all the recommendations that the FAA says you should do. So number one, Section 25 and Regulation 1419 ice protection says if you want your airplane to be certified for flight into known icing conditions, then you have to be able to operate in continuous maximum and intermittent maximum icing conditions of Appendix C. And we'll look at that Appendix C. We're going to look at continuous maximum and intermittent maximum, whatever that means. Then also it says you have to, an analysis must be performed to establish that the ice protection equipment for various components on the airplane is adequate, and that to verify that to check for icing anomalies and to demonstrate the ice protection system and its components are effective, the airplane and or its components must be flight tested in various operational configurations in measured natural atmospheric icing conditions. In other words, you can't just do wind tunnel tests to show that the airplane will be able to fly in icing conditions. You actually have to take the airplane up into the clouds and look for icing conditions, and then be able to show the FAA that the airplane can de-ice and continue flying without any adverse conditions to the aircraft. So that's what aircraft manufacturers do whenever they want their aircraft certified for flight into known icing conditions. Typically what they do is, first they kind of do a check. They put icing shapes on the wings. They kind of glue them on there to see if there's any aerodynamic effects. And then, and typically these are made of styrofoam or something like that, just to simulate the disruption of airflow over the wings. After they do that, they contract with, or they may themselves have a cloud microphysical equipment where they can measure cloud droplets and also temperature and liquid water content. And then they take the airplane and fly in those conditions and try and find points that meet the icing envelope. So what I'm going to show you next, I'll show you now, is the icing envelope. This is Appendix C of Part 25, and it's very specific as far as what kind of conditions an airplane needs to be flight tested in. Along the vertical axis is the liquid water content. In this case, this is for continuous maximum. In other words, this is stratiform clouds. They use kind of strange words, continuous maximum and intermittent maximum. When they say continuous maximum, they mean stratiform clouds, and when they say intermittent maximum, they mean cumulus clouds. Cumulus clouds, in other words, don't extend for hundreds of miles, whereas stratus clouds do. So that's what they mean by continuous, and then intermittent would be cumulus, punching through Q's. So as I said, along the vertical axis, you got liquid water content. Along the bottom, you've got the medium volume diameter, or it says here medium mean effective drop diameter. So this is the size of the drop. It's measured in microns. Notice that for stratus clouds, the envelope goes from 15 microns, which is the typical size of a cloud drop, all the way up to 40 microns, which is starting to get kind of large. And liquid water contents aren't very high. They only go up to about 0.9 grams per meter cubed, which is actually kind of low, somewhat low. Here's your cumulus clouds, and you can see that liquid water contents are much higher. They go up to approximately, it looks like 3 grams per meter cubed, which is a pretty juicy cloud. And then the drop size goes once again from 15 microns all the way up to 50 microns. Now, when you get up to 50 microns, that is all you need to do for flight testing. In other words, when you go up into a cloud, you need to get certain liquid water contents, you need to get certain cloud droplets that fit in that envelope. Anything bigger, you don't need. As a matter of fact, does that mean that there are not drops that exist in the atmosphere that are bigger than that? They don't exist? No. It means that your airplane was not flight tested in those icing conditions. So this is a problem. There are conditions in the atmosphere where you will be flying outside of this envelope, perhaps. And 50 microns, we'll come back and talk about that. When the droplets are bigger than 50 microns, we call those supercooled large drops, or SLDs. And that is a huge problem for any airplane. And it's brought down a number of airplanes over the years. We'll be talking about that later on in other videos.
Supercooled large drops are such a concern that in 2015 the FAA came out with new regulations under Part 25 to certify aircraft for flight into clouds or precipitation that is composed of supercooled large drops. In 2015, the new regulations state that the airplane should be able to have a means to detect when it's operating in SLDs and then also safely exit those conditions. This is the new Icing envelope for SLDs, and it's for aircraft certified, once again, after November 4th, 2015. I'm not sure which aircraft have been certified for flight into SLDs, but you can check with the FAA and hopefully they can get back to you. That is a quick overview of the regulations pertaining to icing, as well as the certification of aircraft for flight into known icing conditions.